So closing cost is the difference between purchasing from a reseller versus purchasing from a sponsor. So typically closing costs when we're looking at purchasing from a reseller, it's going to run you 3, 4, 5%, within that range. And customarily, it's in that situation, usually the seller pays the transfer tax. So this is going to be the largest shift when we see the difference between a closing cost and buying from a reseller versus from a new construction sponsor seller. When you buy as a purchaser from a sponsor, you are essentially paying for the privilege to own the unit before anyone else has owned it. And typically, and what's customary in New York, is that a purchaser will pay for the transfer tax as well. And that comes out to about an additional 2% of the purchase price. And that's not including mansion tax that's applicable across the board. For any property or unit that are over $1 million, the purchaser has to pay an additional 1% of that purchase price as taxes. But that's something that's common to both the reseller and sponsor. So, to recap, for transfer tax purposes, when we're looking at a sponsor sale, there's a shift from who's responsible for the payment of the New York State and New York City transfer tax that comes out to approximately 2%. Whereas for the reseller situation, the seller is responsible for paying it, and in the sponsor sale situation, it's the purchaser's responsibility to pay it. And then on top of that, closing cost wise, we also have, depending on the specific condo, you're going to also have to pay other closing costs, such as the sponsor's attorney's legal fee, any sort of escrows or deposits required for the condo, any sort of additional first months of common charges. Potentially you're going to pay for a pro rata share of the residential manager's unit. So that's a unit allocated for a residential manager that would stay on the premises, presumably, and manage the property. So as a first-time purchaser from a sponsor sale, you would have to contribute a pro rata amount based on the common element percentage owned for that unit to pay for that unit, so that residential manager can live there as well. For any property, you're going to need a valid certificate of occupancy before any sort of occupancy is allowed for the unit. And that's the case whether it's for residential purpose, retail purpose, commercial purpose. The CO essentially allows different types of uses for that property. When we're talking about a residential unit, you need a specific certificate of occupancy that allows it to be occupied for residential purposes. So a lot of times or all the time rather, when we see a sponsor develop a property, they're not going to be able to get a CO until the end phases of the property, until each of those units are actually done to the level where it's ready for occupancy for residential purposes, if you're talking about residential unit. So the first or preliminary CO, what we see is going to be called, the temporary CO, where most of the issues that are required in order for occupancy to begin have been resolved, but we still have some, we can say, finishing touches that have yet to be completed by the sponsor before a final CO can be issued. So once again, in New York, you're allowed to occupy a unit even with a temporary CO. They typically run for 3-month periods, so you can still close on a unit even though a temporary CO has been issued. It's the sponsor's obligation and responsibility to make sure that's continuously renewed until a final CO is ultimately issued, and at which point they've satisfied that obligation as far as certificate of occupancy is concerned. So getting into the topic of differences of the inspection and the final walkthrough process for resale property versus a sponsor sale property. In a resale property, we typically have, and we discussed this before, is an inspection is done prior to contract execution. So you can see the state of the property, what it's like before you sign the contract. And as you go through the closing process, once you approach closing, a couple of days before the actual closing process, you as the purchaser would go through the property again to do a final walkthrough, just to make sure that the current state of the property that you're closing on at the time is very similar to what you saw in the initial inspection, so that no other further adjustment is needed. This is different than in a sponsor sale, because when you typically sign a sponsor sale contract, if it's, once again, in the earlier phases, the project may not be fully developed yet. All you've seen so far is a model unit. There is no unit per se to make an initial inspection of. So there is technically no initial inspection. When the property is, or when the units are actually done being built out and they're ready to close on the unit to deliver to a purchaser, that's when you would actually get your first walkthrough of the property. So at that point, before your closing, you would go on a tour of the property you're about to purchase and close on, and you would submit punch list items to the sponsor. So you'd be able to walk through the unit and see, for example, if any of the molding is off, or if there's damage to any doors, windows, a leak in the bathtub, sort of like minor things that can be touched up because it is a new construction. So most of the understanding is that everything is in brand new condition. Everything was just built after all. Nobody else has lived there. So an inspection typically is going to be limited to that final walkthrough period. And the sponsor, after closing and after having received the punch list items from the purchaser, will go ahead and then take care of those things for you after the closing. And that's just generally understood. So resale restrictions and resale fees are typically common for new construction sponsor sales, only because a sponsor wants to also protect their interest in the number of units they have on hand. So for example, if it's a large development and there may be 100 units that are for sale, a sponsor typically does not want to sell for the first wave of units just so that after they're sold, for those purchasers to come in and flip the units either for a higher price or even a lower price to undercut the sponsor's efforts to sell future units. So that this way the sponsor can make sure that for a certain period of time that they have no outside competitors that they need to compete with in order to sell any of the remainder of their units that haven't already been sold. So this restriction period we typically see is varied between, it's based on the specific condo, but we typically see 1 to 2 years, where sometimes there's specific clarifications that say a resale isn't permitted until the sponsors have sold either an X number of units or positions, or after they've given up a certain number of their board seats on the condo board. So that's something that we can talk about in the future as well, that when a sponsor develops a property, you typically have a condo board that has multiple seats, and sponsors will typically keep on hand a number of those board seats because they do have ownership of the majority of the units, and slowly over time they will relinquish those board seats as they sell more units to the future ownership. So once the resale restriction period ends, depending on the restrictions given for each specific condo, that's when the first-time purchasers are able to finally go and sell at market price their units if they so desire to. During that period, there typically isn't a resale fee, and during the initial period, if a sponsor allows during any restriction period for a purchaser to resell a unit, that's when we're talking about, depending on the restrictions imposed by the condo, there may be a resale fee that's either a flat fee or a percentage of the profits, or it could be a percentage of whatever the sale at the market price is. So that's going to be different and going to be a case-by-case situation. So just know that that does exist if a sponsor does allow a purchaser to go ahead and resell a unit.